The Missouri frontier in 1867 didn't forgive weakness, and Eliza Rowan had been weak exactly once in her life, the day she let her father convince her they could hold on to the farm without help. Now, standing in the doorway of their cabin with the smell of sickness thick in the air behind her, she watched the dust cloud from Garrett's horses fade into the prairie and knew that single moment of weakness was going to cost them everything. "Eliza?" Her father's voice scraped out from the bedroom, barely louder than the wind rattling the loose shingles. She didn't answer right away. Couldn't. Her throat was too tight with the kind of anger that had nowhere to go except inward, where it sat like a stone in her chest. "I'm here, Papa." Thomas Rowan had been a strong man once, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who could work sunup to sundown and still have energy to teach his daughter how to read by candlelight. But consumption didn't care about strength. It had hollowed him out over the past 8 months, turning him into something fragile and gray, something that coughed blood into handkerchiefs and pretended not to see her washing them in the creek. She moved to his bedside, trying not to let her face show what she was thinking. The room was dim despite the afternoon sun. They'd sold the good curtains 3 months ago, but the flour sacks she'd hung in their place blocked the light just fine. "Was that Garrett?" he asked. "Yes." "What did he want?" Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle him. "Same thing he always wants. Money we don't have." Thomas closed his eyes. His hand, thin as kindling, fumbled for hers. "I'm sorry, girl. I'm so sorry." "Stop." The word came out sharper than she meant it. She softened her voice. "You didn't do this. The drought did. The cattle fever did. You just got sick at the worst possible time." 48 hours, he said. It wasn't a question. She shouldn't have been surprised he'd heard. The walls were thin, and Garrett had a voice that carried. "Yes. And we have $17 and some change." They needed 800. The number sat between them like a living thing, too big to look at directly. Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, gone flat. "There's the land itself. It's worth something." "Not enough, and even if it was, I'm not selling it out from under you." "Eliza." "No." She stood, needing to move before the helplessness could settle into her bones. "I'll figure something out." "There's nothing to figure out." He started to say more, but the coughing cut him off. Deep, rattling coughs that shook his whole frame. She grabbed the water basin, held it while he coughed into it, and tried not to look at the red that splattered against the white ceramic. When it passed, he lay back against the pillows, exhausted. "You should go to town," he whispered. "See if Martha will take you in. She's always said, 'I'm not leaving you. I'm already gone, girl, just taking my time about it.' Papa, listen to me." He gripped her hand with surprising strength. "If you stay here when the bank comes, they'll take everything and you'll have nothing. At least if you go now, you can start over somewhere. Maybe find work. Maybe what? Scrub floors? Take in laundry?" She pulled her hand free. "I'd rather burn the place down than hand it to Garrett." "Eliza Rowan, you listen." But she was already walking out, unable to hear another word about giving up. The afternoon air hit her face like cold water, clearing some of the thickness from her lungs. She stood on the porch, sagging boards that needed replacing, just like everything else around here, and looked out at the farm her father had built from nothing. 40 acres of stubborn prairie that fought them for every crop. A barn that leaned slightly to the left. Fences held together with hope and wire. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Or it had been, before the drought killed the wheat, and the fever killed the cattle, and the medicine for her father's lungs killed their savings. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and about to be homeless. In a town like Cedar Bluff, that made her either pathetic or scandalous, depending on who you asked. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when she finally went back inside. Her father was asleep, or pretending to be. She heated up the last of the soup, more water than vegetables at this point, and ate standing at the stove because sitting down felt like admitting defeat. 48 hours. She must have stared at that soup for 20 minutes, watching the thin broth cool and congeal, before the knock came at the door. For a wild second, she thought it might be Garrett coming back early, and her hand actually reached for the rifle by the door before she stopped herself. Shooting the bank's enforcer wouldn't solve anything, probably make things worse. But it wasn't Garrett on the other side of the door. The man standing on her porch was tall, broad across the shoulders, in a way that spoke of real work, not just size. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so carefully blank. He wore good clothes, not fancy, but well made, the kind that would hold up to hard use, and his boots had actual heels instead of being worn down to nothing. She didn't recognize him. "Miss Rowan?" His voice was low, rough-edged. "Who's asking?" "Name's Rhett Mercer. I've got a proposition for you." Every warning her mother had ever given her about strange men went off in her head at once. "Not interested." She started to close the door, but he spoke quickly. "It's about your father's debt." Her hand froze on the door. "What about it?" "I'd like to pay it off." The world seemed to tilt slightly. "Why?" "Because I need a wife, and you need money." Seems straightforward enough. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that surprised them both. "You're insane." "Practical. You don't even know me. I know you're about to lose everything. I know you've been running this farm almost single-handed for 8 months while your father dies by inches. I know you threatened to shoot Samuel Garrett last month when he tried to repossess your plow horse." He paused. "I know you're smart enough to recognize an opportunity when you hear one." The anger that had been simmering all day suddenly boiled over. "Opportunity? You think I'm so desperate I'd just, what, marry some stranger who shows up at my door like he's buying cattle?" "Yes." He said it simply, without malice. "I think you're exactly that desperate, because if you weren't, you wouldn't still be standing here listening to me." She wanted to hit him, wanted to slam the door in his face and pretend this conversation had never happened, but he was right, and they both knew it. "Why?" she asked again. "Why do you need a wife badly enough to pay $800 for one?" Something flickered in his expression, too fast to read. "My reasons are my own, but I can promise you this. I'll clear your father's debt completely. I'll make sure he has medicine and a doctor for whatever time he has left. And in 6 months, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." 6 months. That's all I'm asking. 6 months of marriage. If you hate it, you walk away with enough money to start over anywhere you want. If you don't, he shrugged, we figure it out from there. It was insane. Completely insane. But the rifle barrel from that afternoon flashed through her mind again, along with the smile on Garrett's face and the sound of her father coughing blood in the next room. "I need to think about it," she said. "You've got until tomorrow night. After that, the offer expires." "Why tomorrow?" "Because that's when I leave, with or without a wife." He turned to go, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Rowan, I'm not a good man, but I'm not a cruel one either. I won't hurt you, and I won't force you into anything you don't agree to. That's the best promise I can make." Then he was gone, walking back toward a horse she hadn't even noticed tied to the fence post. A good horse, she noticed. Well-fed, well cared for. The kind of horse that cost real money. She stood in the doorway long after he'd ridden away, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to black. Inside, her father called for her. She went to him, helped him drink some water, listened to him apologize again for things that weren't his fault, and all the while, Rhett Mercer's words echoed in her head. "I think you're exactly that desperate." She hated that he was right. Sleep didn't come that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to her father's labored breathing through the thin wall, and tried to think of any other option. Any way out that didn't involve marrying a complete stranger. By dawn, she still hadn't found one. Thomas was awake when she brought him breakfast. Thin oatmeal and weak tea, the best she could manage. He looked at her face and knew immediately that something had changed. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. All of it. The stranger's offer, the promise of money, the 6-month term. She expected him to be angry, or horrified, or to forbid it outright. Instead, he was quiet for a long time. Then, "What do you know about this man?" "Nothing. That's the problem." "Then find out." He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, propping pillows behind his back. "You've got until tonight, don't you? Go into town, ask around. If he's dangerous, if there's anything that makes you think you won't be safe, you tell him no and we figure something else out." "There is nothing else, Papa." "Then we lose the farm. We've lost things before. But never like this, never everything at once." She didn't say it out loud, but she didn't have to. He knew. She went to town. Cedar Bluff wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a bank, a church, two saloons, and a scattering of other buildings that served the ranchers and farmers scattered across the surrounding territory. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant finding information about Rhett Mercer should have been easy. It wasn't. The man at the general store had never heard of him. Neither had the blacksmith or the postmaster or any of the three people she managed to corner outside the church. It was like Rhett Mercer didn't exist. She was about to give up when old Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived in Cedar Bluff longer than anyone could remember, grabbed her elbow outside the general store. "You're asking about the Mercer man," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know him?" "Know of him. Got a place up in the mountain country, past the northern ridge. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes to town maybe twice a year for supplies." "What kind of place?" Mrs. Patterson shrugged. "Ranch, I think. Or mine. Something up there. Nobody goes that far into the mountains much, so there's not a lot of talk about it." "Is he—" Eliza hesitated, trying to figure out how to ask the question. "Is he dangerous?" The old woman gave her a sharp look. "Why are you asking?" "He made me an offer. I'm trying to decide if I should take it." "What kind of offer?" "The kind I can't afford to refuse." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, studying Eliza's face. Then she nodded slowly. "I can't tell you he's a good man. Don't know him well enough. But I can tell you I've never heard stories about him being violent or cruel, and I've never seen him drunk, which is more than I can say for most men around here." She paused. "Whatever he offered you, girl, make sure you know what you're trading for it. Once you're married, you're his. Law says so." "I know. Do you?" The old woman's grip tightened. "My daughter married a man who seemed kind enough. Turned out he had a temper once he got her alone. She died 3 years later, and everyone pretended it was an accident." Ice ran down Eliza's spine. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be smart." Mrs. Patterson released her arm. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's with your eyes open." Eliza thanked her and walked back toward home, her mind churning. The lack of information should have been reassuring. No horror stories, no warnings about violence or cruelty. But it also meant she'd be marrying a ghost, a man who existed in rumors and absences, who kept himself so far from civilization that even the town gossips didn't know his business. The sun was setting when she reached the farm. Her father was sitting up in bed, which was a good sign, and he watched her face carefully as she came in. "Well?" he asked. "Nobody knows him. He's got a place in the mountains. That's all anyone could tell me." Thomas nodded slowly. "So you're deciding blind?" "Yes." "What does your gut say?" She thought about it. Really thought about it. Tried to separate the desperation from the instinct, the fear from the truth. "My gut says he was honest. When he told me he wasn't a good man but wasn't cruel, I believed him." "That's not much to build a marriage on." "No, but it's more than I'll have if I say no." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Papa, I need you to tell me if you think this is wrong. If you think I shouldn't do it." He reached for her hand. His skin was paper thin, burning with fever. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever known, and I think if anyone can survive this, it's you." He paused. "But I also think you need to know, if you do this, you do it for yourself, not for me. I'm not going to be around long enough for it to matter. Don't—" "It's true, and you know it." His grip tightened. "So if you marry this man, you make sure it's because you want a chance at a different life, not because you're trying to save a dead man." The words hit like a slap. She started to argue, but he was already coughing again, and by the time it passed, she'd lost the thread of what she wanted to say. She stayed with him through the evening, reading aloud from one of the few books they still owned until he fell asleep. Then she went out onto the porch and waited. Rhett Mercer arrived just after full dark, riding the same good horse as before. He dismounted and walked to the porch steps, but didn't climb them. Just stood there, waiting. "I have conditions," Eliza said. Something flickered in his expression. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. "Name them. My father gets the best medical care available. Not just medicine, a real doctor, as often as he needs one. Done. If I leave after 6 months, I get $500. Not a penny less. Done. And you don't touch me unless I say you can." He didn't even hesitate. "Done." She studied his face, trying to read the truth beneath the careful blankness. Why is this so easy for you? Why aren't you negotiating? Because I'm getting what I want and so are you. Why would I make it harder than it needs to be? What do you want? The question burst out before she could stop it. You never actually said. Why do you need a wife? For the first time, something real showed in his expression. Not quite pain, but close. Because I'm tired of being alone. And because there are things I need help with that I can't do by myself. He met her eyes. That honest enough for you? It should have been. But there was something else there, something he wasn't saying. She could feel it like a splinter under her skin. Still, what choice did she have? We do this at the courthouse, she said, with a witness, legal and proper. Agreed. And I want it in writing, all of it, the 6 months, the money, the conditions. I'll have papers drawn up tomorrow. She took a deep breath, let it out slow. Then I guess we have a deal, Mr. Mercer. He climbed the steps then and held out his hand. She took it. His grip was warm, calloused, steady, the handshake of a man who worked for a living. We'll leave the day after tomorrow, he said. That give you enough time to get ready? Ready for what? The ranch is a 2-day ride into the mountains. You'll want to pack accordingly. 2 days into the mountains, away from everything and everyone she knew, with a man who was still fundamentally a stranger. She must have let some of the fear show on her face because his expression softened slightly. I know this isn't easy, but I meant what I said. I won't hurt you. And if at the end of 6 months you want to leave, I'll bring you back myself and give you the money I promised. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. He said it matter-of-factly. But you don't have a better option, and we both know it. There it was again. That brutal honesty that somehow felt more trustworthy than any pretty promise could have. He left shortly after, with plans to return the next day with the marriage papers and supplies for the journey. Eliza watched him ride away, then went back inside to where her father lay sleeping, and let herself cry for the first time in months. Not because she was sad, not even because she was scared, though she was. She cried because in 48 hours her entire life was going to change, and she had no idea if she was being saved or making the worst mistake of her life. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Red arrived mid-morning with the papers, just as promised. A contract that laid out every condition they'd agreed to, written in clear language and signed by a lawyer from the next town over. She read it 3 times before signing, half expecting to find some trap hidden in the words. She didn't. The ceremony itself was brutally short. They rode to the courthouse together, her on the old plow horse, him on his gelding, and stood before the county clerk while he mumbled through the legal requirements. No family, no celebration, just 2 people making a transaction that happened to involve a marriage license. You may kiss the bride, the clerk said, sounding bored. Rhett looked at Eliza. She looked back. Neither of them moved. Or not, the clerk muttered, making a note in his ledger. Congratulations. Next. They were married. Eliza felt nothing. No joy, no relief, just a strange numbness that followed her through the rest of the day. She packed what little she owned into 2 canvas bags, clothes, a few books, her mother's locket. Not much to show for 23 years of living. Her father was having a good day, relatively speaking. Alert enough to understand what was happening, lucid enough to grip her hand and tell her he loved her. You come back if you need to, he said. You hear me? 6 months or 6 days, if that man gives you any reason to run, you run straight back here. There won't be a here to run back to, Papa. Then you run anyway, promise me. She promised. The doctor Rhett had hired arrived that afternoon, a tired-looking man with kind eyes who examined Thomas thoroughly and left enough medicine to last a month. He also left instructions with Mrs. Patterson, who'd agreed to check on Thomas daily in exchange for a generous payment from Rhett. He's a lucky man, having a daughter like you, the doctor told Eliza. She didn't feel lucky. She felt like she was abandoning him, but when she tried to say as much, Thomas cut her off. You're giving me the best chance I've got. That's not abandonment. That's love. She kissed his forehead, thin skin burning with fever, and walked out before she could change her mind. They left at dawn the next morning. Eliza had never been more than 20 miles from Cedar Bluff in her life. Now she was heading into territory she'd only heard about in stories, the deep mountains where the maps got vague and the settlements got sparse. Rhett had brought a second horse for her, a steady mare that seemed built for mountain travel, and enough supplies to last them a week. "It's a 2-day ride," she said, eyeing the packs. "Why so much?" "Weather changes fast in the mountains, and it's better to have too much than not enough." They rode in silence for most of the first day. The prairie gradually gave way to foothills, then to steeper terrain covered in pine and aspen. The air got thinner, colder. Eliza found herself watching Rhett more than the landscape, trying to learn something about the man she'd married. He rode like someone who'd spent his whole life on horseback. Easy in the saddle, alert but not tense. Every so often, he'd scan the horizon or the tree line, and she wondered what he was looking for. Trouble? Or just habit? They stopped for lunch beside a creek, and Eliza finally broke the silence. "How long have you had the ranch?" 5 years. "You built it yourself?" "Mostly." That's not much of an answer. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "I had help. Hired men, mostly. Some I trust, some I don't." "Which category do I fall into?" "Haven't decided yet." She should have been insulted. Instead, she found herself almost liking the honesty. At least he wasn't pretending this was something it wasn't. They rode until sunset, then made camp in a clearing that showed signs of previous use. A fire ring, flattened grass, the remains of a log bench. Rhett set up a tent for her without being asked, then built a fire and started cooking something that smelled better than anything she'd eaten in months. "Rabbit stew," he said, noticing her watching. "And biscuits if you're hungry." She was hungry. Starving, actually. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a full meal. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time since this whole insane plan had started, Eliza felt something almost like hope. Maybe this wouldn't be terrible. Maybe she could survive 6 months with this quiet, careful man who kept his promises and made good stew. Then he spoke, and the hope shattered. "There's something you should know before we get there." The way he said it made her stomach drop. "What?" "The ranch. It's not what you're expecting." "You said it was a ranch." "It is, but it's—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's bigger than I led you to believe." Eliza set down her bowl. "How much bigger?" "Big enough that it might make you angry when you see it." "Why would it make me angry?" He met her eyes across the fire. "Because you married me thinking I was barely surviving, and that's not true." The world seemed to tilt. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I lied about being poor. The ranch is successful, very successful. And when you see it, you're going to realize I could have offered you a lot more than I did." For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Then the rage hit, hot and overwhelming. "You son of a bitch!" She stood, shaking with fury. "You let me think. You stood there and let me believe you were some desperate rancher barely scraping by, and all this time, I didn't say I was poor. You assumed it. You lied by omission, and you damn well know it." She wanted to hit him, wanted to scream. "Why? Why would you do that?" He stood too, and for the first time she saw real emotion in his face, anger to match her own. "Because the truth would have brought trouble I didn't need. Because the last time someone knew how much I had, they tried to kill me for it. Because out here, showing weakness is safer than showing strength. So you married me under false pretenses. I married you under the terms we agreed to. Terms you accepted. Terms that don't change just because the ranch is bigger than you thought. I could have asked for more." "Yes, you could have." He didn't flinch. "But you didn't. And I'm not going to apologize for protecting what's mine." They stared at each other across the fire, breathing hard. And Eliza realized with cold clarity that she'd just made a terrible mistake. Not in marrying him, that might still work out, but in thinking she understood what she was getting into. This man was dangerous, not violent maybe, but dangerous all the same. "I want to go back," she said. "No. You can't keep me here." "I can't know. But if you walk away now, you break the contract, which means your father doesn't get his medicine and you don't get a dime." He said it flatly, without malice, just stating facts. "So you can be angry all you want. But you're not going anywhere until the 6 months are up." He was right. She was trapped, and he knew it. Eliza turned and walked into the tent without another word. lacing it shut behind her with shaking hands. She lay on the bedroll he'd provided, staring at the canvas ceiling, and tried not to cry again. Outside, she could hear him banking the fire, moving around the camp with quiet efficiency. Eventually, the sound stopped, and she knew he'd settled down for the night. She didn't sleep, just lay there, listening to the wind in the trees and wondering what the hell she'd gotten herself into. Tomorrow she'd see the ranch, see the empire this quiet, careful, lying man had built, while pretending to be something he wasn't. And then she'd have to decide whether 6 months in a beautiful prison was better than freedom with nothing. She already knew the answer. That's what made it so much worse. Dawn came cold and gray, filtering through the canvas tent like accusation. Eliza had managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and those had been restless, full of half-formed dreams about contracts written in languages she couldn't read, and doors that locked from the outside. She heard Rhett moving around outside, the quiet sounds of someone who was used to working alone. Part of her wanted to stay in the tent out of pure spite, but her bladder had other ideas, and besides, she'd never been good at hiding. When she emerged, he was crouched by the fire, coaxing it back to life. He looked up, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. She didn't answer, just walked past him into the trees to take care of necessities, then came back and accepted the tin cup he offered without meeting his eyes. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. They packed up camp in silence. Eliza rolled her bedding with sharp, angry movements, shoving it into the saddlebag harder than necessary. She could feel him watching her but refused to look his way. "We've got about 6 hours of riding ahead," Rhett said as she mounted the mare. "Terrain gets rougher from here." "Fine." "Eliza," I said fine. He studied her for a moment, then nodded and swung into his own saddle. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, turning the sky from gray to gold, and Eliza tried to take some comfort in the beauty of it. It didn't work. The landscape changed as they climbed higher. The pine forest grew denser, the trails narrower. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses over sections where rock slides had blocked the path. Eliza's legs ached from the unfamiliar exertion, her hands raw from gripping the reins, but she'd be damned if she'd complain. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses at a stream that cut through a narrow valley. Eliza slid from the saddle and immediately regretted it. Her muscles had stiffened during the ride, and for a moment she wasn't sure her legs would hold her. Rhett was beside her before she could fall, one hand steadying her elbow. She jerked away from him. "I'm fine. You're not used to riding this long. There's no shame in that. I don't need your help." "Noted." He let go and stepped back, hands raised slightly. "But you're going to hurt yourself if you don't stretch those muscles out." She wanted to argue, but he was right, and they both knew it. She walked a few steps away from him, working her legs, trying to ignore the way he watched her with that careful, assessing gaze. "How much farther?" she asked finally. "Another 3 hours. Maybe 4, depending on how the horses hold up." 3 more hours of this silence. 3 more hours of pretending she wasn't furious and scared and completely out of her depth. "You're angry," Rhett said. "Brilliant observation. You have a right to be." That brought her head up. Don't you dare try to be understanding now. You lied to me." "I omitted information. That's different." "Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "You let me think you were desperate, that you needed this marriage as much as I did, and all the while you were sitting on some fortune in the mountains, playing games." "It wasn't a game." His voice hardened. "And I do need this marriage, just not for the reasons you assumed." "Then what reasons? You said you were tired of being alone, but that's not the whole truth, is it? There's something else, something you're not telling me." He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. Finally, "When we get to the ranch, you'll understand. Until then, you're just going to have to trust that I had good reasons for doing things the way I did." "Trust?" She laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's rich, coming from a man who's been lying since the moment we met." "I never lied about what mattered. The contract we signed, every word of that is true. 6 months, and you're free to go if you want. With the money I promised. That hasn't changed." "No, just everything else." She turned away from him and walked to her horse, checking the saddle straps with hands that shook slightly. Behind her, she heard him sigh. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I am sorry. Not for protecting my interests, but for letting you think less of me than I am. That wasn't fair." She didn't answer, couldn't, without her voice breaking. They rode on. The afternoon stretched long and exhausting. The trail climbed higher, winding through passes that made Eliza's stomach lurch when she looked down at the drops beside them. Rhett rode ahead, sure-footed and steady, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still following. She hated that she needed to follow, hated that without him, she'd be completely lost in these mountains. Hated most of all that some small part of her was starting to understand why he'd hidden the truth. Out here, away from civilization, things were different. The rules were different. And maybe, just maybe, a man who showed his wealth became a target. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. They crested a final ridge just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, and Rhett reined in his horse. Eliza pulled up beside him, ready to ask why they'd stopped. Then she saw it. The valley below them opened up like something out of a dream or a hallucination. Wide and green, protected on three sides by mountains, cut through by a river that caught the late afternoon light like hammered silver. And spread across the valley floor, arranged with careful precision, was a ranch that made her father's 40 acres look like a garden plot. A main house, 2 stories tall and built from timber and stone. Barns, plural, she counted at least 4, that looked new and well-maintained. Corrals filled with horses. Fields sectioned off for crops and pasture. A sawmill beside the river, its wheel turning lazily in the current. Smaller buildings she couldn't identify from this distance, arranged like a small village. And everywhere, people. Tiny figures moving between buildings, working, living. This wasn't a ranch, it was a kingdom. "You bastard," Eliza whispered. Rhett said nothing, just sat his horse and watched her take it in. "How many acres?" 2,000, give or take. 2,000. She couldn't even visualize that much land, couldn't comprehend the wealth it represented, the work it would take to maintain, the power it gave him. "How many people work for you?" 30 year-round, more during harvest season. 30 people. 30 families, probably, depending on their support, all of them answering to the man beside her, the man who'd offered her $800 like it was pocket change. "I could have asked for 10 times what you gave me," she said. 100 times. "Yes." "And you would have paid it?" "Probably." She turned to look at him then, really look at him. He met her gaze without flinching, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not guilt, exactly. More like resignation. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" she asked. "Why all the secrecy?" "Because the last woman who knew what I had tried to steal it. And the man before her tried to kill me for it." He said it flatly, like he was reciting facts. "Out here, the truth gets people hurt. Or worse. I'm not them. I know that now, but I didn't know it when I showed up at your door." Eliza looked back at the valley, at the empire spread below them, and felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there, sharp and hot, but it was mixing with something else now, something closer to awe, or maybe fear. This was what she'd agreed to. This was the world she'd married into, without knowing it. "Come on," Rhett said, nudging his horse forward. "It'll be dark soon, and I'd rather not navigate that last stretch in the shadows." The descent was treacherous, the trail switching back on itself a dozen times as it wound down the valley wall. Eliza's mare followed Rhett's gelding with steady confidence, which was good, because Eliza herself was too overwhelmed to focus properly on riding. As they got closer, the scale of everything became even more apparent. The main house wasn't just large, it was beautiful, built with an attention to detail that spoke of real money and real skill. The barns were newer than the house, she realized, probably built as the operation expanded. And the people moving between buildings stopped what they were doing to watch as Rhett rode past, some nodding and greeting, others just staring. At her, she realized. They were staring at her. Of course they were. The boss had left for town and come back with a wife. That was gossip worth stopping work for. Rhett led them to the main house and dismounted smoothly. A young man, boy, really, couldn't be more than 16, appeared from the direction of the nearest barn and took the horses without being asked. "Welcome back, Mr. Mercer," he said, then glanced at Eliza with barely concealed curiosity. "Ma'am, this is my wife, Eliza," Rhett said. "Eliza, this is Danny. He helps with the horses." "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Danny's ears went red. "You too," Eliza managed. She slid from the saddle, managed not to stumble this time, and followed Rhett up the steps to the front door. Her legs felt like water, her head light from exhaustion and shock. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Not because it was ugly, it wasn't, but because it was proof, undeniable and overwhelming, of exactly how much Rhett had hidden from her. The front hall was wide and well lit, with real glass windows and furniture that looked like it had been shipped from back east. A staircase led to the second floor, the banister carved with a level of detail that spoke of craftsmanship, not just function. Through an open door to the left, she could see a sitting room with actual upholstered chairs and a stone fireplace big enough to stand in. "I'll show you to your room," Rhett said. He led her upstairs and down a hallway with 4 closed doors. He opened the second one on the right, and Eliza stepped into a space bigger than her entire cabin back home. A real bed with a frame and headboard. A wardrobe. A dresser with a mirror. A window that looked out over the valley, now turning purple in the fading light. A washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher. "There's a water pump in the kitchen," Rhett said from the doorway. "But I'll have someone bring up water for washing. You can bathe downstairs once you're settled." A bath. When was the last time she'd had a real bath? Not just a sponge down with creek water. "The wardrobe has some clothes in it," he continued. "I had them brought in before I left. They might not fit perfectly, but they'll do until we can get you to a proper seamstress." She turned to stare at him. "You bought me clothes? You'll need them. Ranch work is hard on fabric." "I'm not doing ranch work. The contract said you'd live here for 6 months. It didn't say you'd spend them sitting idle." His tone was matter of fact, not unkind. "This is a working ranch, Eliza. Everyone contributes. Even me. I don't know anything about ranching. You'll learn. Or you won't. And you'll find something else to do. Either way, you'll pull your weight." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was catching up with her fast. The anger from earlier was still there, but it was buried under layers of fatigue and confusion and the surreal feeling of standing in a stranger's house that was now, legally, hers too. "I'll leave you to get settled," Rhett said. "Dinner's at 6. Come down when you're ready." He left, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Eliza stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, just breathing. Then she walked to the bed and sat down on it, testing the mattress. It was soft. Real feathers, not straw. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to throw something at the wall just to hear it break. Instead, she lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what her life had become in the span of 48 hours. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, someone was knocking on the door. She sat up, disoriented, the room darker now. "Yes?" The door opened a crack and a woman's face appeared. Dark hair streaked with gray, brown skin weathered by sun and wind, eyes that were sharp but not unkind. "I'm Rosa," the woman said. "Mr. Mercer said you'd want water for washing." She pushed the door open fully and came in carrying a large pitcher, which she poured into the basin on the washstand. Behind her came a younger woman, a girl, really, maybe 18, with another pitcher and a stack of towels. "This is my daughter Maria," Rosa said. "We keep house here. Well, try to. Men make terrible messes." Maria giggled, then caught herself and ducked her head shyly. Eliza stood, smoothing her travel-worn dress self-consciously. "Thank you. I didn't expect—" "Of course you didn't." Rosa set the empty pitcher down and gave Eliza a frank assessment. "You didn't expect any of this, did you?" It wasn't really a question, but Eliza answered anyway. "No." "Well, you're here now. Might as well make the best of it." Rosa moved toward the door, then paused. "Dinner's in 20 minutes. I'd change if I were you. Those trail clothes will have the men staring, and not in a good way." After they left, Eliza looked down at herself. Her dress was dusty and wrinkled, stained with sweat and horse smell. She probably looked and smelled terrible. She washed her face and hands in the basin, the water cold and bracing. Then she opened the wardrobe and found what Rhett had mentioned. 3 dresses, simple but well made, in dark practical colors. She chose the plainest one, a brown cotton that looked like it would survive work without showing every stain. It fit reasonably well, a bit loose in the waist, but nothing scandalous. She braided her hair quickly, checked her reflection in the mirror, pale, tired, eyes too big in her thin face, and went downstairs. The dining room was off the main hall, and voices led her there. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The table was long enough to seat 12, but only 4 places were set. Rhett sat at the head, talking to 2 men Eliza didn't recognize. All 3 looked up when she entered. Rhett stood. "Eliza, come in." The other men stood too, and she felt their eyes on her, assessing. One was older, maybe 40, with graying hair and the kind of face that had seen hard living. The other was younger, closer to Rhett's age, with red hair and freckles that made him look boyish despite his size. "This is Jack Crawford," Rhett said, indicating the older man. "He's my foreman, and this is Patrick O'Brien. He runs the timber operation." "Ma'am," Jack nodded, his expression neutral. Patrick smiled, open and friendly. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Mercer. Rhett didn't tell us he was bringing back a wife." "Rhett didn't tell me much either," Eliza said before she could stop herself. An awkward silence fell. Patrick's smile faltered. Jack looked like he was trying not to smirk. Rhett pulled out the chair beside his. "Sit. You must be hungry." She was, actually. Starving. She took the seat and tried not to fidget as Rosa and Maria brought out food. Roasted chicken, potatoes, vegetables that actually had flavor, bread that was still warm from the oven. More food than Eliza had seen in one place in months. "So," Patrick said as they served themselves, "where are you from, Mrs. Mercer?" "Cedar Bluff." "That's 2 days' ride from here. You got family there?" "My father." "What brings you all the way out here?" Patrick's tone was casual, but Eliza could hear the real question underneath. "What the hell are you doing married to Rhett Mercer?" "Patrick," Jack's voice held a warning. "What? I'm just making conversation." "It's fine," Eliza said. She looked directly at Patrick. "I needed money. Rhett needed a wife. It seemed straightforward." You could have heard a pin drop. Patrick's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Jack coughed into his napkin. Even Rosa, bringing more bread from the kitchen, paused mid-step. Rhett, to his credit, didn't react at all, just continued eating like she'd commented on the weather. "Well," Patrick said finally, "that's honest." "I try to be." The rest of the meal passed in stilted conversation, mostly between the men about ranch business, cattle counts, timber contracts, something about a fence that needed mending on the north pasture. Eliza ate in silence, listening, trying to build a picture of this place in her head. It was complex, more complex than she'd imagined. The ranch wasn't just raising cattle and horses. They had timber operations, which meant logging and sawmill work. They had crops, winter wheat from what she could gather. They had contracts with someone named Harrison for something involving the railroad, though that part of the conversation got tense and they changed subjects quickly. "We need to talk about the Morgan situation," Jack said, as Rosa cleared the plates. "Not now," Rhett said. "It can't wait much longer. He's getting bold." "I said not now." Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded and stood. "If you'll excuse me, ma'am, nice to meet you." Patrick followed him out, leaving Eliza alone with Rhett at the big table. "Who's Morgan?" she asked. "A problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind you don't need to worry about." He stood. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be long." "Rhett?" "Good night, Eliza." He left before she could press further, and she sat there alone, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night. Rosa appeared to extinguish the lamps, nodded at her without speaking, and disappeared again. Eliza climbed the stairs to her room, every muscle protesting. She undressed, washed again in the now cold water, and crawled into bed wearing the shift she'd found in the dresser. The bed was soft. The sheets were clean. Through the window she could see stars scattered across the night sky like salt spilled on black cloth. She should have felt relieved, safe even. She had shelter, food, security, everything she'd been desperate for just days ago. Instead, she felt trapped. In the morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices outside. She dressed quickly in one of the work dresses from the wardrobe and went downstairs. The house was empty. Through the windows, she could see people moving around the yard, working, always working. The ranch was already awake and busy, and she had no idea what she was supposed to do with herself. She found the kitchen and helped herself to coffee from the pot on the stove. Rosa appeared a moment later with an armful of vegetables. "You're up," she said. "Good. Can you cook?" "Yes." "Thank the saints. Maria tries, but she burns everything. Rosa dumped the vegetables on the table. We feed 30 men, 3 times a day. More during harvest. You can help or you can stay out of the way, but those are your only choices. Eliza looked at the pile of vegetables, then at Rosa's no-nonsense expression, and made a decision. Where do you want me to start? Rosa's face softened slightly. Potatoes. Peel them. We'll need about 20 pounds for lunch. So Eliza peeled potatoes, and after that she chopped carrots, and after that she helped knead dough for bread. By noon her hands were cramping and her back ached, but there was something almost soothing about the work. It was simple, clear, unlike everything else in her life right now. The men came in for lunch in shifts, filling the dining room with noise and appetites. Eliza stayed in the kitchen, helping Rosa and Maria serve, and tried not to meet anyone's eyes when they stared at her. They're curious, Rosa said, seeing her discomfort. They'll get over it. How long have you worked here? Eliza asked. 4 years, since Mr. Mercer bought the mill. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron. He's a good man, even if he's difficult. Pays fair, doesn't cheat. That's rare out here. Do you know why he needed a wife? Rosa gave her a long look. That's between you and him. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true. Rosa turned back to the stove. Whatever his reasons, they're his to tell, not mine. Eliza helped clean up after lunch, then Rosa shooed her away. Go explore, learn the place. You can't hide in my kitchen forever. So Eliza went outside into the afternoon sun and started walking. The ranch was even bigger up close than it had looked from the ridge. She counted 6 barns total, each dedicated to different functions: horses, cattle, storage, equipment, hay, and one she couldn't identify. The sawmill was a massive operation, the wheel turning constantly, the sound of cutting wood carrying across the valley. Men nodded at her as she passed, some friendly, some wary. She found the vegetable garden behind the main house, bigger than her father's entire farm. Found the chicken coops, the root cellar, the bunkhouse where the unmarried workers slept. She was examining the fence around one of the corrals when a voice behind her made her jump. It's good construction, cost a fortune, but it'll last. She turned to find Patrick O'Brien leaning against a fence post, his red hair bright in the sun. Sorry, he said. Didn't mean to startle you. It's fine. How are you settling in? I've been here less than a day. Ask me again in a week. He grinned. Fair enough. He pushed off the post and came to stand beside her. For what it's worth, I think you handled dinner pretty well last night. Most women would have pretended it was a love match. I'm not most women. I can see that. He was quiet for a moment. Listen, I know this place can be overwhelming, and Rhett's not exactly warm, but he's a good man, better than most. You're the second person to tell me that today. Because it's true. Patrick's expression turned serious. He's got his reasons for being the way he is, and maybe someday he'll tell you what they are. But until then, try not to judge him too hard. Why does everyone defend him like he's some kind of saint? He lied to me. Did he? Or did he just not tell you everything? Patrick held up a hand before she could answer. Look, I'm not saying he handled it perfectly, but out here, trust is earned, not given. And the fact that he married you at all says something. Says what? That he's willing to take a risk. Rhett Mercer doesn't take risks, ever. Until now. Before she could respond, a shout went up from the direction of the south pasture. Patrick's head snapped around, his easy demeanor vanishing. Trouble? Eliza asked. Maybe. Stay here. He jogged off toward the commotion, and Eliza watched him go, debating whether to listen. She'd never been good at following orders, even sensible ones. She followed. By the time she reached the south pasture, a crowd had gathered, men on horseback, others standing in a loose circle. And in the center, Rhett and Jack, facing 3 riders she didn't recognize. The man in the middle was older, maybe 50, with the kind of hard face that came from years of getting his way through force. The 2 flanking him were younger, harder, with hands that rested too casually near their sidearms. I told you, the older man was saying, his voice carrying across the pasture. I don't appreciate being ignored. And I told you, Rhett replied, his tone flat and dangerous, that your offer wasn't acceptable. That hasn't changed. Everything changes, Mercer. You just haven't figured that out yet. Morgan. Jack's voice held a warning. So this was Morgan. The problem Rhett hadn't wanted to discuss. Morgan's eyes flicked to Jack, then past him to the crowd, and landed on Eliza. His expression shifted, calculating. Well, well, who's this? Rhett went very still. None of your concern. New hire? Morgan urged his horse a few steps closer, studying Eliza with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Pretty. Too pretty for ranch work. Leave her alone, Rhett said quietly. Or what? You'll shoot me? Morgan laughed. In front of all these witnesses? I don't think so. The tension ratcheted up a notch. Eliza could feel it, thick and dangerous. Several of the ranch hands had shifted position, hands moving toward weapons they probably weren't supposed to have. His wife. The words came from Patrick, who'd appeared at Eliza's elbow. He said them loud enough for everyone to hear. The effect was immediate. Morgan's expression went from amused to shocked to calculating in the space of a heartbeat. His eyes moved from Eliza to Rhett and back again. Wife, he repeated. You got married. 2 days ago, Patrick continued cheerfully. Brought her back from Cedar Bluff. Isn't she lovely? Eliza wanted to kill him. Drawing Morgan's attention to her was the last thing she wanted, and Patrick had just painted a target on her back. But Rhett's expression had changed too. Some of the tension had left his shoulders, and when he looked at her, there was something almost like relief in his eyes. So you finally found someone willing to put up with you, Morgan said. Congratulations. Doesn't change anything. Actually, Rhett said, it does. The North Pasture land I've been considering selling? Not anymore. My wife likes the view. We're keeping it. Morgan's jaw tightened. That land should be mine. Then you should have bought it when you had the chance. Now get off my property before I have you removed. For a moment, Eliza thought Morgan might actually draw his gun. His hand twitched toward it, and the two men with him tensed. But then Morgan smiled, cold and sharp. This isn't over, Mercer. It never is with you. Morgan wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The crowd didn't disperse until they were out of sight. Then Rhett turned to Eliza, and his expression was unreadable. We need to talk. Yes, she said, we do. He led her away from the pasture, away from the curious eyes and listening ears, to a spot beside the river where the sound of water would cover their voices. I'm sorry, he said before she could speak. I should have warned you about Morgan. Who is he? A neighbor. If you can call someone 20 miles away a neighbor. He wants to expand his operation, and he's decided my land is the way to do it. Why doesn't he just buy his own? Because mine is better water access, better timber, better everything. Rhett picked up a rock and threw it into the river. He's been pushing for 2 years now, making offers, making threats when the offers didn't work. And now I'm part of it. Yes. He looked at her directly. Patrick telling him you're my wife. That was smart. It gives you protection. Morgan won't touch you now because hurting you would give me grounds to go after him publicly. I don't want to be a chess piece in whatever game you're playing with that man. You already are. The moment you married me, you became part of this. His voice was matter of fact, not apologetic. I'm sorry if that's not what you signed up for, but it's the truth. Eliza stared at him, at this man who kept revealing new layers of complication every time she thought she understood him. What else haven't you told me? A lot. That's not good enough. It'll have to be, for now. He started walking back toward the house, then paused. For what it's worth, you handled that well. Standing there, not backing down. Morgan respects strength. He'll think twice before coming after you directly. How comforting. It should be. Out here, reputation is everything, and right now your reputation is that you're strong enough to stand beside me. That's worth more than you know. He left her standing by the river, and Eliza watched the water rush past, carrying away debris and sediment, wearing down the rocks one grain at a time. That's what this place would do to her, she realized. Wear her down, change her, turn her into something she didn't recognize. The question was whether she'd fight it or let it happen. She didn't have an answer yet. The days that followed Morgan's visit settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt less like living and more like waiting for something to break. Eliza threw herself into work because it was easier than thinking, helping Rosa in the kitchen, learning the patterns of the ranch, mapping out in her head where everything was and who did what. She learned that Danny wasn't just a stable boy, but had a gift for gentling horses that had been ruined by rough handling. That Maria could sew better than anyone Eliza had ever met, but couldn't carry a tune to save her life. That Jack Crawford had a wife and 2 daughters living in a cabin on the eastern edge of the property, and he walked home to them every night no matter how late the work ran. She learned the ranch ran on schedules as precise as clockwork: breakfast at 5 for the men who worked the livestock, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. In between, there was always something that needed doing: fences that needed mending, equipment that needed repair, animals that needed tending. The work never stopped, and neither did the people doing it. What she didn't learn was anything more about Rhett. He was gone most days, riding out early and coming back late, and when he was around, he was surrounded by Jack or Patrick or one of the other men discussing things that stopped the moment she came within earshot. At meals, he was polite but distant, asking her how she was settling in with the kind of formal courtesy you'd use with a house guest, not a wife. She told herself it didn't matter. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. 6 months and she'd be gone. But it bothered her anyway. A week after Morgan's visit, Eliza was in the garden pulling weeds when Rosa found her. "Mr. Mercer wants to see you in his office." Eliza sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. "Office?" "Off the library, east side of the house." Rosa's expression was unreadable. "He doesn't usually call people to the office unless it's serious." That was comforting. Eliza stood, brushed off her skirt, and went inside, following Rosa's directions to a room she'd passed several times but never entered. The door was half open, and she could see Rhett sitting behind a desk covered in papers, his attention focused on something he was reading. She knocked on the door frame. He looked up. "Come in. Close the door." She did, suddenly aware of how alone they were. This was the first time they'd been in a room together without other people nearby since their wedding night, and the memory of that argument by the campfire sat between them like a third presence. "Sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them still. "What's this about?" "I got word from Cedar Bluff today." He picked up a letter from the desk. "Your father's doing well. The doctor says the medicine is helping." Relief flooded through her so fast it left her dizzy. "He's improving. Stable, which is better than declining." Rhett set the letter down. "Mrs. Patterson sends her regards. She says to tell you the chickens are still alive, which apparently is significant." Despite everything, Eliza almost smiled. Her father's chickens were notoriously difficult to keep alive. "They are. The doctor will continue visiting twice a week. If anything changes, they'll send word immediately." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "That's not why I called you in here." Rhett leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I need to know if you can ride." "I can sit on a horse without falling off." "That's not what I asked." "Then no." "Not well." "Can you shoot?" The question caught her off guard. "A rifle, yes. My father taught me. I'm not great, but I can hit what I'm aiming at if it's not too far away." "Good. Starting tomorrow, you're going to learn to do both properly." He held up a hand before she could protest. "It's not optional. If you're going to live here, you need to be able to defend yourself and move independently. This isn't Cedar Bluff. There are bears in these mountains, cougars, and men worse than either of those." Morgan, among others. His expression hardened. "Morgan's got a reputation for going after anything he thinks might give him leverage. Right now, the fact that you're my wife protects you, but only if people believe you're actually my wife, not just some woman I'm keeping around." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we need to be seen together, in public, acting like we're actually married." Heat crept up Eliza's neck. "You want me to pretend we're in love?" "I want you to pretend we tolerate each other. Love would be overselling it." He said it without humor. "There's a gathering in 3 weeks. Harrison's throwing it at his place. He's the one with the railroad contracts. Everyone who matters will be there, and they'll all want to see my new wife. And if I refuse, then you make both of us look weak, and Morgan will take that as an invitation to push harder." Rhett's voice was flat. "I'm not asking you to like it. I'm telling you what needs to happen." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to throw his words back at him and remind him that the contract didn't say anything about playing dress-up for his business associates. But he was right, and they both knew it. She'd walked into this world knowing nothing, and ignorance out here could get you killed. "Fine," she said. "I'll go to the gathering. I'll smile and play the dutiful wife. But after that, you owe me an explanation." For what? For all of it. Why you really needed to get married. What Morgan actually wants. Why everyone here treats you like you're one wrong move away from violence. She leaned forward. I'm not stupid, Rhett. I see the way Jack watches the road. The way the men all carry guns even though this is supposed to be a working ranch. Something's wrong here, and I'm tired of being kept in the dark. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the valley. You're right, he said finally. You deserve to know, but not yet. Not until after Harrison's gathering. Why? Because what you don't know can't slip out in conversation. And Harrison's place will be full of people looking for any advantage they can find. He turned back to face her. 3 weeks. That's all I'm asking. After that, I'll tell you everything. It wasn't good enough. But looking at his face, at the tension in his jaw, the wariness in his eyes, Eliza realized he wasn't going to budge. Whatever he was protecting, it mattered more than her frustration. 3 weeks, she said, and then no more secrets. No more secrets, he agreed. She stood to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. Eliza? She turned. For what it's worth, I am sorry. For all of it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just walked out and closed the door behind her, leaving him alone with whatever ghosts he was keeping company with. The next morning, Jack showed up at the house before dawn with 2 horses saddled and ready. Boss says you need to learn to ride properly, he said without preamble. That means we start now, before the heat sets in. Eliza, still half asleep and resentful about being dragged out of bed at an unholy hour, considered telling him exactly where he could put that horse. But she'd agreed to this, and backing out now would only prove she couldn't handle it. So she climbed into the saddle and followed Jack out into the pre-dawn darkness, her body already protesting the early hour and the familiar ache of unfamiliar muscles being asked to work. Jack wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He put her through her paces with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, teaching her how to sit properly, how to use her legs instead of just her hands, how to read the horse's body language and respond to it. By the time the sun was fully up, Eliza's thighs were screaming, and she was pretty sure she'd developed blisters in places she didn't know could blister. You're not terrible, Jack said as they walked the horses to cool them down. You've got decent balance. You just need practice. How long did it take you to learn? I grew up on a horse, so never really learned, just always knew. He glanced at her. But I've taught plenty of people who didn't. You'll get there. How long? Couple months if you practice every day. Less if you're motivated. They rode every morning after that, sometimes with Jack, sometimes with Patrick when Jack was needed elsewhere. Eliza learned to handle different horses, different terrain, different situations. She learned what to do if a horse spooked, how to navigate rocky trails without breaking her neck, how to read the weather by watching the way the animals moved. And slowly, grudgingly, she started to get better. The shooting lessons came in the afternoons, taught by a quiet man named Thomas, who ran the mill and apparently had been a sharpshooter in the war. He set up targets in a clearing away from the main buildings and handed Eliza a rifle that was better maintained than any she'd ever touched. Your father taught you to shoot for food, Thomas said, watching her check the rifle with the automatic caution her father had drilled into her. I'm going to teach you to shoot for survival. It's different. He was right. Shooting at targets was one thing. Learning to shoot fast, to reload under pressure, to hit something that might be moving or shooting back, that was something else entirely. Thomas pushed her harder than Jack had, demanded more precision, more speed, more consistency. Out here, he said one afternoon as she struggled to hit a target he'd placed behind partial cover, hesitation gets you killed. You see a threat, you evaluate it in seconds, and you respond. There's no time for doubt. What if I'm wrong? Eliza lowered the rifle, her shoulders aching. What if I shoot someone who wasn't actually a threat? Then you live with it. But you live. Thomas's expression was harder than she'd seen it. I've made that choice. So has Rhett. So has every man on this ranch who's worth a damn. The question isn't whether you'll have to make it. It's whether you'll be able to pull the trigger when the time comes. The words haunted her through the rest of the lesson and into the evening. She'd never thought of herself as violent, but out here, violence wasn't optional. It was currency, the price of survival. She was cleaning the rifle in the barn when Rhett found her. Thomas says you're a quick study, he said, leaning against a support beam. Thomas is generous. He's honest. If you were bad, he'd tell you. Rhett watched her work for a moment. How are the writing lessons going? I haven't fallen off in 3 days. That's progress. It is. He was quiet for a beat. Jack says you asked him about the property boundaries. I wanted to know where I'm allowed to go. You can go anywhere on the ranch, but don't cross the northern boundary without someone with you. That's Morgan's land. Eliza set down the cleaning rod. How big is his operation? Bigger than mine. More land, more cattle, more men. Rhett's jaw tightened. But his land is worse, drier, less timber. The river that cuts through my property? It starts on his land, but the best access points are all on mine. That's what he wants, water rights. Can't he just dig wells? He's tried. The water table's too deep in most places. And where it's not, the water's alkaline. Undrinkable for livestock. Rhett pushed off the beam. He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years. When that didn't work, he started trying to force me out. How? Sabotage. Rumors. Anything to make my operation look unstable or dangerous to potential buyers and partners. His expression darkened. Last year, he tried to block my timber contracts by spreading stories that my mill was producing substandard lumber. Cost me 3 months of income before I could prove it was lies. And you think marrying me helps with that somehow? I know it does. Marriage means stability. It means I'm building something permanent, not just trying to cash out and run. It makes me harder to displace. He met her eyes. It also means Morgan can't claim I'm running some kind of criminal operation or house of ill repute. Those rumors were starting to circulate too. Eliza felt heat rise in her face. Because you're unmarried and successful? Because I'm unmarried and private. People fill in blanks with whatever serves their purposes. He moved toward the barn door. Anyway, thought you should know what you're up against at this gathering. Harrison's crowd is more sophisticated than Morgan, but they're just as dangerous in their own way. What do you mean? I mean, they'll smile while they pick you apart. They'll ask questions that sound innocent, but are designed to make you slip up. And they'll be watching everything. How you dress, how you speak, how you interact with me, looking for any sign of weakness they can exploit. Sounds delightful. It's necessary. His tone made it clear the conversation was over. Rosa will help you get ready. She knows how these things work. He left, and Eliza sat in the quiet barn surrounded by the smell of horses and hay and gun oil, wondering what the hell she'd gotten herself into. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience, it was warfare, and she was a weapon he'd acquired to fight it. The question was whether she was sharp enough to be useful or whether she'd break the first time someone tested her edge. The weeks leading up to Harrison's gathering passed in a blur of preparation that felt increasingly surreal. Rosa took over Eliza's wardrobe with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, bringing in a seamstress from a town 2 days' ride away to create a dress that was, in Rosa's words, appropriate for the wife of a successful rancher. The result was beautiful and uncomfortable in equal measure, deep green silk that brought out the color in Eliza's eyes, with details that must have cost a small fortune. When Eliza protested the expense, Rosa just shook her head. "This isn't about you looking pretty," she said, pinning the hem. "This is about you looking like you belong. There's a difference." "I don't belong." "Then you better learn to fake it, because these people will eat you alive if they smell weakness." Maria, working on the sleeve details, nodded fervently. Mrs. Harrison once made a woman cry just by commenting on her gloves. "That's horrible," Eliza said. "That's society," Rosa corrected. "And you're part of it now, whether you like it or not." Eliza practiced riding until her body stopped aching and started just accepting the motion as normal. She practiced shooting until she could hit a target the size of a man's chest from 50 yards without thinking about it. And she practiced being Rhett's wife, which was harder than either of the other two. They started taking meals together, just the two of them, in the dining room. Rosa insisted it was important that they learn to talk to each other without the buffer of other people, and she was right. The first few dinners were excruciating, long silences punctuated by stilted conversation about the weather or the ranch operations. But slowly, painfully, they started to find a rhythm. Rhett told her about the timber contracts he was negotiating, the challenges of running an operation this size with the constant threat of sabotage hanging over it. Eliza told him about Cedar Bluff, about her father's farm, about the small struggles that had seemed so overwhelming before she saw what real problems looked like. "You miss it," Rhett said one evening, watching her face as she talked about the way the wheat fields looked at sunset. "I miss simple," she admitted. "I miss knowing what my life was going to look like tomorrow." "Is this really so bad?" She considered the question honestly. "No, it's just different, and difference is hard." He smiled, a small, rare thing that transformed his face from severe to almost handsome. "I can't argue with that." 3 days before the gathering, a writer came from Cedar Bluff with a letter from Mrs. Patterson. Eliza's hand shook as she opened it, terrified of what it might say. But the news was good. Her father was stable, even improving slightly. The doctor said he might have months instead of weeks, which was more than they'd hoped for. He sent his love and told her not to worry, which was impossible but appreciated anyway. Rhett found her in the garden afterward, the letter still clutched in her hand. "Good news?" he asked. "He's doing better. The medicine is working." "I'm glad." She looked up at him. "Thank you for keeping your promise about his care. I know I've been difficult about everything else, but I'm grateful for that. You don't need to thank me for doing what I agreed to do." But his expression had softened. "You want to write back? I can have someone write it to town tomorrow." She did write back, sitting at the desk in Rhett's office with paper and ink he provided, telling her father everything and nothing, that the ranch was big, that the people were kind enough, that she was learning things she never expected to learn. She didn't mention Morgan or the gathering or the fact that she spent half her time wondering if this was all going to collapse around her. She didn't want him to worry. He had enough to deal with. The morning of Harrison's gathering dawned clear and cold, the kind of mountain autumn day that made everything look sharp and bright. Eliza woke early, her stomach churning with nerves she refused to name as fear. Rosa was already in her room when she came back from washing, the green dress laid out on the bed like a challenge. "You're going to be fine," Rosa said, reading her face. "Just remember, these people are human. They bleed and worry and doubt just like you do. They just hide it better." "That's not as comforting as you think it is." "It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true." Rosa started helping her into the dress, her movements practiced and efficient. "You're Rhett Mercer's wife. That carries weight. Use it." The dress fit perfectly, cinched at the waist and falling in soft folds to the floor. Maria had curled Eliza's hair the night before, and now Rosa pinned it up in a style that looked elegant without being fussy. A touch of color on her lips, a bit of powder to hide the sun damage on her cheeks, and Eliza barely recognized the woman looking back at her from the mirror. "See?" Rosa said with satisfaction. "You look like you belong." Eliza didn't feel like she belonged. She felt like a fraud in expensive clothing, playing a part she hadn't rehearsed well enough. But when she came downstairs and saw Rhett waiting in the hall, dressed in a suit that must have been tailored specifically for him, something shifted. He looked different like this, less like a rancher and more like someone who could command a room full of powerful men without saying a word. He saw her and went still. "You look—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "Rosa did good work." "Rosa did all the work. I just stood there." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Still, you look the part." "What part is that?" "Someone worth fighting for." The words hit her unexpectedly, making her chest tight. Before she could respond, Patrick appeared in the doorway, grinning. "The carriage is ready, and might I say, you two clean up remarkably well." They rode to Harrison's place in a carriage Eliza hadn't even known Rhett owned, pulled by 2 horses that looked like they cost more than her father's farm. Patrick drove, which meant Eliza and Rhett were alone in the enclosed space, sitting across from each other in silence. "Nervous?" Rhett asked after a while. "Terrified." "Good. That'll keep you sharp." He leaned forward slightly. "Remember what we talked about. Let me do most of the talking. If someone asks you a direct question, answer honestly but briefly. Don't elaborate unless they push, and if they push too hard, defer to me." "You make it sound like a battle." "It is. Just one fought with words instead of weapons." He held her gaze. "Stay close to me. Don't wander off alone. And if Morgan shows up, which he will, don't engage with him. At all." "You think he'll try something?" "I think he'll try to rattle you, make you uncomfortable. If you react, he wins." The Harrison estate appeared through the trees, and Eliza's breath caught. She'd thought Rhett's place was impressive, but this was on another level entirely. The house was massive, built in a style that belonged back east, not in the mountain territories. Carriages lined the drive, horses tied to posts, people in expensive clothes moving between the main house and what looked like a separate building set up for entertaining. "How rich is this man?" Eliza asked. "Rich enough that he doesn't have to count." Rhett's expression was unreadable. His father made a fortune in shipping. Harrison multiplied it through railroad contracts and land speculation. He owns half the territory, directly or indirectly. "And he's your friend?" "He's my business partner. That's not the same thing." The carriage stopped, and a man in livery opened the door. Rhett stepped out first, then turned and offered Eliza his hand. She took it, grateful for the steadiness of his grip as she navigated the step down in the unfamiliar dress. People were staring. She could feel their eyes, assessing, judging, calculating. Rhett must have felt her tense because his hand moved to the small of her back, a gesture of possession that was probably meant to be reassuring. It wasn't, but she didn't pull away. They moved through the crowd toward the main house, and Eliza tried to catalog faces, voices, anything that might be useful later. Most people nodded politely to Rhett, their expressions carefully neutral. A few ignored him entirely, which seemed more insulting than outright hostility. And then a man appeared in front of them, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that came from a lifetime of being listened to. "Mercer," he said warmly, "you made it." "Harrison." Rhett shook his hand. "Thank you for the invitation." Harrison's eyes moved to Eliza, and his smile widened. "And this must be the bride I've heard so much about." "Eliza, this is James Harrison. Harrison, my wife. Eliza." "Mrs. Mercer." Harrison took her hand and actually bowed over it like they were in some ballroom instead of the mountain frontier. "I must say, Rhett, when I heard you'd gotten married, I assumed it was another wild rumor. I'm delighted to be proven wrong." "We like to keep people guessing," Eliza said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. Harrison laughed. "I can see why he chose you. Come, both of you. There are people you need to meet." He led them through the crowd, making introductions that Eliza tried desperately to remember. Men who owned mines and lumber operations and cattle empires, women dressed in fashions that must have been shipped from San Francisco or even New York, wearing jewelry that cost more than most people made in a year. Everyone smiled. Everyone was polite. And everyone, Eliza noticed, was watching Rhett with the kind of calculation that made her skin crawl. They were in the middle of a conversation with a couple who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory when Morgan appeared. He looked different than he had at the ranch, cleaned up, dressed well, playing the part of a respectable businessman. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, dangerous. "Mercer," he said, his tone just slightly too friendly. "I was hoping you'd be here." "Morgan," Rhett's voice was flat, "and Mrs. Mercer." Morgan turned his attention to Eliza, and she felt Rhett's hand tighten slightly on her back. "How lovely to see you again. I hope you're settling in well at your new home." "Very well, thank you." "Good, good. It can be isolating, living so far from civilization. I'm sure you must miss Cedar Bluff." There it was, the probe. The test to see if she'd admit to unhappiness, give him ammunition to use against Rhett. "I miss some things," Eliza said carefully, "but I'm finding mountain life has its own rewards." "Such as?" "Such as quiet. Cedar Bluff was always too crowded for my taste." Rhett made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Morgan's smile tightened. "Well," he said, "if you ever find yourself wanting company, my door is always open. We neighbors should look out for each other." "How kind," Eliza said, not meaning it at all. Morgan's eyes flicked to Rhett. "I assume you've told your wife about our little disagreement regarding water rights?" "There's no disagreement," Rhett said evenly. "You want something that isn't for sale. That's not a disagreement, that's just reality." "Reality changes, Mercer. You should remember that." The threat hung in the air between them, barely disguised. Eliza felt tension radiating off Rhett, saw the way his jaw had tightened, and made a decision. She stepped slightly forward, putting herself between the two men. "Mr. Morgan," she said pleasantly, "I'm sure whatever business you have with my husband can wait until after the party. It seems rude to discuss such things at a social gathering, don't you think?" For just a second, Morgan's mask slipped and she saw pure fury in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that smooth, dangerous smile. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me, Mrs. Mercer. You're absolutely right." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Rhett turned to look at Eliza, his expression unreadable. That was either very brave or very stupid, he said quietly. Can it be both? This time he did laugh, and some of the tension left his shoulders. Come on. Harrison's about to start the actual business part of this gathering, and we need to be there for it. The next 2 hours were some of the most exhausting of Eliza's life. Harrison gathered everyone in a large room set up like a meeting hall and proceeded to discuss railroad expansion, timber contracts, land deals, and a dozen other topics that Eliza barely understood. She sat beside Rhett, watching him navigate conversations with the skill of someone who'd been doing this for years, and realized just how little she actually knew about the man she'd married. He wasn't just a rancher. He was a player in a game much bigger than she'd imagined, dealing with men who controlled territories the size of small countries. And he held his own against all of them, never backing down, never showing weakness. It was impressive. It was also terrifying. By the time they left Harrison's estate, the sun was setting and Eliza's head was pounding from the effort of staying alert and appropriate for so many hours. She collapsed into the carriage seat with something approaching relief. You did well, Rhett said once they were moving. I feel like I was one wrong word away from disaster the entire time. That's because you were. But you didn't say that word, and that's what matters. He looked at her in the dim light of the carriage. The way you handled Morgan, that was smart. Diffusing the situation without backing down. Making it about social propriety instead of weakness. I just didn't want him to goad you into doing something you'd regret. Like hitting him in front of everyone? Exactly like that. Rhett smiled grimly. I've wanted to hit Morgan for 2 years, but you're right. Today wasn't the day for it. They rode in silence for a while, the carriage swaying gently on the rough road. Eliza felt the adrenaline that had kept her sharp all day finally starting to drain away, leaving her exhausted and oddly emotional. You promised me answers, she said quietly. After the gathering. No more secrets. Rhett was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he nodded. Tomorrow, he said. I'll tell you everything, but not tonight. Tonight we both need rest. Tomorrow, she agreed. But when tomorrow came, it wouldn't bring answers. It would bring fire, blood, and the first real test of whether their partnership could survive what Eliza was about to learn. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke. For a confused moment, still caught between sleep and waking, she thought Rosa must have started the kitchen fires early. Then she realized the smell was wrong, too acrid, too thick, coming from the wrong direction entirely. She threw off the blankets and ran to the window. Orange light flickered against the darkness outside, not from the main house but from somewhere near the barns. Her heart kicked into a panicked rhythm as she fumbled for clothes, pulling on the first dress her hands found. The hallway was already chaos. Rhett was coming out of his room, half-dressed, his face hard with the kind of controlled fury that was somehow worse than shouting. Jack appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard. The mill, he said. It's burning. Rhett swore, a single vicious word, and took the stairs 3 at a time. Eliza followed without thinking, her bare feet loud on the wooden steps. By the time she reached the front door, Rhett was already outside, running toward the orange glow that had grown brighter in the second since she'd first seen it. The mill was fully engulfed. Flames climbed the wooden structure like living things, feeding on the dry timber and sawdust that must have been everywhere inside. Men were running from all directions, from the bunkhouse, from the barns, from the smaller cabins scattered around the property. Someone had organized a bucket line from the river, but Eliza could see even from here that it was useless. The fire was too big, too hot, too far gone. Get the horses out of the stable, Rhett was shouting, and move everything away from the main barn. If the wind shifts, we'll lose it too. Patrick appeared beside him, his face streaked with soot. It was set deliberately. I found oil cans near the foundation. Morgan, Jack said, his voice tight with rage. Probably, but we can't prove it. And right now I don't care. Rhett turned to scan the crowd of men. Danny, take Eliza back to the house. I can help, Eliza protested. You can get killed. Danny now. Danny materialized at her elbow, looking apologetic, and Eliza let him lead her away because arguing would only waste time Rhett didn't have. But she didn't go inside. She stood on the porch and watched the mill burn, watched the men fight a battle they'd already lost, and felt rage build in her chest so hot it rivaled the flames. This was Morgan's work. She knew it with absolute certainty, even without proof. This was his answer to Rhett's refusal to sell, his response to seeing them together at Harrison's gathering. This was what happened when you stood up to powerful men who weren't used to being told no. The mill burned for 3 hours before there was nothing left to burn. By the time the sun came up, the structure was just smoking timbers and ash, and every man on the ranch looked like they'd been to war. Rhett stood at the edge of the destruction, his face black with soot, his hands blistered from hauling water. Jack was beside him, and Patrick, and Thomas, all of them staring at what used to be the heart of their timber operation. Eliza approached slowly, carrying water she'd pumped from the kitchen. Rhett took the ladle without looking at her and drank like a man dying of thirst. "How bad?" she asked quietly. "Bad." His voice was hoarse from smoke. "That mill was worth $20,000, minimum. The lumber inside, another $5. The contracts I can't fill now because I don't have a working mill." He stopped, his jaw working. "I'll have to rebuild. But that takes time and money, and Morgan knows it. He's betting this will force me to sell while I'm weak." "Will it?" He looked at her then, and she saw something dangerous in his eyes. "No, but it'll hurt like hell while I figure out how not to." Rosa appeared with food for the men, and Eliza helped distribute it, moving through the exhausted workers with bread and cold meat and whatever else they could pull together quickly. The men thanked her with tired voices, and she realized with a strange jolt that they saw her as one of them now, not the boss's wife, just another person trying to survive Morgan's vendetta. It should have felt good. Instead, it just made her angrier. By mid-morning, Rhett had gathered his key men in the office. Eliza wasn't invited, but she stood outside the door anyway, listening through the gap he'd left open. "We file a claim with the territorial marshal," Jack was saying. "Show him the oil cans, the evidence of arson." "And Morgan will claim he had nothing to do with it," Patrick countered. "He's too smart to get his own hands dirty. It'll be some hired men we can't trace back to him." "So we do nothing?" Jack's frustration was obvious. "We do what we've always done." Rhett's voice was steady, but Eliza could hear the exhaustion underneath. "We rebuild. We absorb the loss. We don't give him the satisfaction of seeing us break." "That's not strategy. That's surrender." "No. Surrender is selling him what he wants. This is survival." There was more argument, voices rising and falling, but Eliza stopped listening. She walked away from the door and out of the house, needing air that didn't smell like smoke and defeat. She found herself at the remains of the mill without consciously deciding to go there. The heat had finally died down enough to approach, though the ground was still too hot to stand on for long. She picked her way around the perimeter, looking at the destruction, and her mind kept circling back to one thought. This was her fault, not directly. She hadn't set the fire. But Morgan had done this because of her. Because Rhett had married her, shown up at Harrison's gathering with a wife, proved he wasn't going anywhere. If she hadn't been here, if Rhett had stayed alone and vulnerable looking, maybe Morgan would have waited, would have tried different tactics. "Stop it." She turned to find Rhett standing behind her, his face still marked with soot, his eyes bloodshot from smoke. "Stop what?" "Blaming yourself. I can see it in your face. You don't know what I'm thinking." "Yes, I do. Because I'd be thinking the same thing if our positions were reversed." He moved closer, careful where he stepped. "But this isn't your fault. Morgan's been looking for an excuse to escalate for months. You're just the convenient reason he picked now instead of later." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to make you understand that this was always going to happen. The only question was when." He rubbed his face, leaving new smudges. "I owe you an explanation. About all of it. That was supposed to happen today anyway, before—" He gestured at the ruins. "So, tell me." He looked at the destroyed mill for a long moment, then nodded. "Come on, not here." He led her to the river, to a spot upstream from the ranch buildings where the water ran clear and fast over smooth stones. They sat on a fallen log, and for a while Rhett just stared at the water like he was trying to find words in the current. "I wasn't always like this," he said finally. "Careful, paranoid, closed off." "What changed?" "I fell in love with the wrong woman." He said it flatly, like he was reciting facts that no longer had the power to hurt him. "Her name was Catherine. I met her in Denver 5 years ago when I was just starting to make real money from the ranch. She was beautiful, smart, and she seemed genuinely interested in what I was building out here." Eliza stayed quiet, letting him talk. "I told her everything, every plan, every asset, every vulnerability. I was young and stupid and in love, and I thought that meant trust." His hands clenched. "She was working with a man named Davis. He owned a competing operation and wanted my water rights. Catherine was supposed to get me to sign them over, or at least get enough information that Davis could force me to sell. What happened? I found out before she could finish the job. Found letters between them, detailing the whole scheme. His voice was bitter. Davis tried to kill me when he realized I knew. Hired men to ambush me on a supply run. I survived. Barely. Jack was with me. That's how we became friends. He saved my life that day. And Catherine? Gone. Disappeared the same day I found the letters. I never saw her again. He picked up a stone and threw it into the water. After that, I learned to keep secrets, to hide the true extent of what I had, to present myself as barely surviving instead of thriving, because letting people see weakness is safer than letting them see strength. Until you couldn't hide anymore. Until the ranch got too big to hide completely, and Morgan started circling like a shark who smells blood. Rhett turned to look at her. I needed a wife because unmarried successful men out here are either targets or suspects. They're assumed to be criminals or perverts or too unstable to build something lasting. Marriage makes you legitimate, respectable, harder to displace. So you used me, yes. He didn't flinch from it, but I also chose carefully. I could have married anyone, some desperate widow, some town girl looking for security, but I chose you. Why? Because I watched you for 3 days before I came to your door. Watched you run that farm almost single-handedly, fight with Garrett without backing down, care for your father even when it was clearly killing you to watch him die. His eyes were steady on hers. I chose you because you were strong enough to survive this place, and because I thought maybe you might be strong enough to stand beside me when things got hard. Like now. Like now. Eliza absorbed this, trying to separate her anger at being used from her understanding of why he'd done it. You still should have told me the truth from the beginning. You're right, I should have, but I've spent 5 years learning that trust gets you killed, and I couldn't just turn that off because I needed a wife. He stood, brushing dirt from his pants. I know that's not good enough, but it's the truth. She stood too, facing him. What happens now? With Morgan? With the mill? With all of it? Now we fight. We rebuild. We prove we're not going anywhere. His expression hardened. And we find a way to make Morgan regret ever setting foot on this property. How? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. They walked back to the ranch in silence, and Eliza felt the weight of everything settling onto her shoulders. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't just 6 months of playing house until she could take her money and leave. This was real. The danger, the stakes, the consequences of the choice she'd made back in Cedar Bluff when she'd had no other options. The question was whether she was willing to fight for something that had started as a transaction. Whether she could stand beside this complicated, damaged man and help him defend what he'd built. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had 3 months left on the contract, and a lot could happen in 3 months. The next week was brutal. Rhett barely slept, spending every waking hour either meeting with men about rebuilding the mill or riding out to meet with the territorial marshal about the arson. The marshal came, looked at the evidence, took statements, and left with promises to investigate that everyone knew meant nothing. Morgan was too careful, too connected, too good at covering his tracks. Eliza threw herself into ranch work with an intensity that surprised even Rosa. She helped in the kitchen, managed supply inventories, even started learning the bookkeeping because Rhett was too exhausted to keep up with it himself. It felt good to be useful, to have a purpose beyond just being a decorative wife. But the tension was building. She could feel it in the way the men moved around the property, always watching the horizon, always armed. Jack had doubled the night guards, and Patrick had started sleeping in the barn nearest the road, just in case. The second attack came 8 days after the fire. This time, it was the cattle. Someone drove 30 head through a cut fence in the middle of the night, scattering them across Morgan's land. By the time the ranch hands discovered it in the morning, half the cattle had been shot by Morgan's men, claimed as trespassers on Morgan's property. Rhett rode to Morgan's ranch that same day, and Eliza insisted on going with him. "This is going to get ugly," Rhett warned. "Good. I want to see his face when you confront him." Jack came with them, along with Patrick and 4 other men, all armed. They rode in formation, deliberate and unmistakable, and Eliza felt her heart hammering the entire way. Morgan's ranch was smaller than Rhett's, but meaner. The buildings looked functional but graceless, built for efficiency rather than permanence. Men watched them approach from the barns and corrals, hands near weapons, faces hostile. Morgan himself came out onto the porch of his main house, coffee cup in hand, looking for all the world like he'd been expecting them. "Mercer," he called, "what brings you to my humble property?" Rhett dismounted but stayed near his horse. "You know exactly what brings me here. You cut my fence and drove my cattle onto your land so you could claim justification for shooting them. I shot trespassing cattle that were destroying my grazing land. That's well within my rights, after you drove them here yourself." Morgan's smile was cold. "That's quite an accusation. You have proof?" "We found the cut fence, fresh cuts, done with wire snips, not worn through." "Fences break, cattle wander. That's not my problem." Morgan took a sip of his coffee. "Although I'd be happy to discuss compensation. For the damage to my land, of course." Rhett's hand moved toward his gun, and Eliza saw Morgan's men tense in response. Jack put a hand on Rhett's shoulder, a silent warning. "This isn't over," Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Morgan agreed. "It's not. But it could be. Sell me the water rights, Mercer. End this now, before more accidents happen." "Go to hell," Morgan's expression hardened. "Careful. You've got a pretty wife now. Accidents can happen to anyone." Eliza felt ice run down her spine. Rhett went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that comes before violence. "If you touch her," Rhett said quietly, "I will kill you. Not hire someone to do it, not arrange an accident. I will put a bullet in your head myself and answer for it in front of a judge if I have to." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." For a long moment the two men stared at each other, and Eliza held her breath, certain this was about to end in bloodshed. Then Morgan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Get off my property, Mercer, and take your loyal little band with you." They rode back in tense silence. Eliza's hands were shaking on the reins, adrenaline and rage making her clumsy. When they finally reached the ranch, Rhett practically dragged her into the house, into his office, and closed the door. "That was stupid," he said, rounding on her. "You shouldn't have come." "I wanted to see—" "You wanted to see a man threaten your life? Congratulations. Now you know exactly how dangerous he is." Rhett paced the small room like a caged animal. "He's escalating. The fire was property. The cattle was money. But threatening you, that's personal." "So what do we do?" "I don't know." He stopped pacing, running his hands through his hair. "Every option I have is bad. If I retaliate, I start a range war that could get people killed. If I don't, he keeps pushing until I break or sell. And if I involve the law, they'll side with him because he's got more money and more connections than I do." Eliza watched him struggle with it, watched the frustration and fear and fury play across his face, and made a decision. "Then we beat him at his own game." Rhett looked at her. "What?" "He's using leverage. Threats, sabotage, pressure. So we find leverage of our own, something that makes him back off without us having to fire a single shot." "There is no leverage. The man's practically untouchable." "Nobody's untouchable." Eliza moved to the desk, where papers were still scattered from Rhett's earlier work. "You said he wants your land because his water is bad, but he's still running an operation. How?" "He buys water rights from smaller ranchers upstream, pays them a premium for access. So he's dependent on them. What happens if they stop selling to him?" Rhett's expression shifted, understanding dawning. He'd be forced to negotiate, or drill deeper wells, which would cost him a fortune. "Can we talk to those ranchers? Offer them something better than what Morgan's paying?" "Maybe, but it would take time and money I'm not sure I have right now with the mill gone." "Then we find another way." Eliza started sorting through papers, looking for something, anything that might be useful. There has to be something, some weakness, some vulnerability. "Wait." Rhett moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a folder. "Harrison mentioned something at the gathering about Morgan's railroad contracts. They're contingent on him delivering lumber by certain dates." So if he can't deliver, he loses the contracts. And he can't deliver without a functioning mill." Rhett's eyes met hers. "Morgan's mill is older than mine was. Less efficient. If something were to happen to it—" "No." Eliza's voice was sharp. "We're not burning down his mill. That makes us just as bad as he is. I wasn't going to suggest arson, but there are other ways to disrupt production. Legitimate ways." He started pulling more papers, his mind clearly racing. Labor disputes, equipment failures, timber supply issues. Any one of those could slow him down enough to jeopardize his contracts. Can you do that without it being traced back to you? Harrison can. He's got connections everywhere, and he's been looking for a reason to put pressure on Morgan. The man's been undercutting his railroad prices for months. Rhett looked at the papers in his hands, then at Eliza. This could work. It's not immediate, but it could actually work. Then do it. He moved toward her, and for a moment she thought he might actually hug her. Instead, he just stood close, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Thank you, he said quietly, for not running, for staying, for trying to help instead of just surviving. I'm still angry with you, she said, for lying, for using me, for all of it. I know. But I'm angrier at Morgan, and I'll be damned if I let him win. Something like relief crossed Rhett's face. Partners? She considered it, considered everything that word meant. The risk, the commitment, the acknowledgement that this was more than just a transaction now. Partners, she agreed. The plan took 2 weeks to set in motion. Rhett rode to Harrison's estate and spent 3 days in meetings that Eliza wasn't privy to. When he came back, he looked exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Harrison's in, he said. He's going to start pressuring Morgan's labor suppliers. Nothing illegal, just business leverage. Make it harder for Morgan to get the workers he needs to meet his contracts. Will it work? Maybe. Probably. Harrison's got more power than Morgan in some circles. Rhett sat heavily in the chair across from her. But it'll take time, weeks, maybe months, and Morgan's not going to just sit back and let it happen. So we prepare for retaliation. We prepare for war. Jack increased security even further. Every man on the ranch was armed at all times. Guards patrolled the property in shifts, day and night. Rhett had new locks installed on all the buildings and kept a rifle by the door of his bedroom. Eliza started carrying a pistol, a small revolver that Rhett taught her to use, making her practice until she could draw and fire in seconds. It felt strange at first, the weight of it in her pocket, the knowledge that she might actually have to use it. But she got used to it, the same way she'd gotten used to everything else in this new life. 2 weeks after Harrison started his campaign, Morgan struck back. It happened on a supply run. Patrick had taken 3 men to town for equipment they needed for the mill reconstruction. They were ambushed on the way back, 5 miles from the ranch. The attackers were masked, but their intent was clear. They wanted blood. Patrick took a bullet in the shoulder. One of the other men, a quiet worker named James, was killed outright. The remaining 2 fought back hard enough to drive the attackers off. But by the time they limped back to the ranch, Patrick was unconscious from blood loss, and James was wrapped in a blanket in the back of the wagon. Eliza was in the kitchen when she heard the shouting. She ran outside to find organized chaos, men carrying Patrick to the house, others standing around the wagon with James's body, faces hard with rage and grief. Rhett was already there, helping to get Patrick inside. "Get Rosa," he barked when he saw Eliza, "and send someone for the doctor." She ran to obey, her heart hammering. Rosa took one look at Patrick's wound and immediately took charge, barking orders for hot water, clean cloth, whiskey for the pain. The doctor was 2 hours away, and Patrick was bleeding badly. "Can you help?" Eliza asked Rosa desperately. "I can try, but I'm not a doctor." Rosa's hands were already working, tearing away Patrick's blood-soaked shirt. "Maria, get me the needle and thread from my sewing kit. Eliza, hold him down." What followed was the longest 2 hours of Eliza's life. Patrick drifted in and out of consciousness while Rosa worked to dig the bullet out and stitch the wound closed. He screamed when he was awake, thrashed when he wasn't, and Eliza held him down with strength she didn't know she had, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. By the time the doctor arrived, Rosa had done what she could. The doctor examined her work, nodded approvingly, and gave Patrick something for the pain that finally let him sleep. "He'll live," the doctor said. "Your housekeeper did good work. Another hour without treatment, and he might not have made it." Eliza found Rhett outside, standing over James's body with Jack and several other men. Their faces were grim, and she could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing response against consequence, anger against strategy. "We bury him tomorrow," Rhett was saying, "and we send word to his family. They get his wages for the next 6 months, no questions asked." "And Morgan?" Jack's voice was hard. We can't prove it was him. Everyone knows it was him. Knowing and proving are different things. Rhett's jaw was tight. We retaliate now. We give him exactly what he wants. An excuse to come at us with everything he has. So we do nothing? James is dead. Patrick nearly joined him. And we're supposed to just accept it? No, we're supposed to be smart. Rhett turned to face his men. Harrison's pressure is working. I got word yesterday that Morgan's missing his contract deadlines. He's starting to hurt financially. If we're patient, if we hold steady, we can break him without losing anyone else. And if he strikes again before that happens, then we make sure we're ready to hit back so hard he doesn't get up. The men dispersed slowly, unsatisfied but willing to follow Rhett's lead. Eliza approached him once they were alone. "Are you all right?" she asked. "No." He didn't pretend otherwise. "A man died today because of me. Because I won't sell land to a bastard who thinks he can take whatever he wants. A man died because Morgan sent people to kill him. That's not your fault, isn't it?" Rhett's eyes were haunted. "I chose this fight. I could have sold, could have walked away, could have avoided all of this. And then what? Let Morgan win? Let him think he can terrorize people into submission?" Eliza stepped closer. "You're fighting for something that matters. For your land, your livelihood, your people. That's not wrong. It is if it gets more of them killed." She didn't have an answer to that, just stood with him in the fading light, surrounded by the evidence of how far Morgan was willing to go, and felt the weight of what they were up against settle even heavier on her shoulders. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jump, every shadow seemed threatening. She finally gave up around midnight and went downstairs thinking tea might help. She found Rhett in the office, working by lamplight, papers scattered across the desk. "Can't sleep either?" he asked without looking up. "No. There's whiskey in the cabinet if you want it." She poured herself a small glass and sat in the chair across from him. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the scratch of his pen on paper and the occasional pop from the lamp. "I'm scared," she said finally. "Good. Fear keeps you careful. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true." He set down his pen and looked at her. "I'm scared too, if that helps. Scared for you, for the men who work for me, for what happens if I can't hold this together." "What do you need?" "I need Morgan to make a mistake. Something big enough that I can use against him publicly. Something Harrison can't ignore, and the territorial authorities can't sweep under the rug." He rubbed his eyes. "But men like Morgan don't make mistakes. They're too careful, too practiced. Everyone makes mistakes eventually." "Maybe, but how many people do I lose waiting for that mistake to happen?" Eliza had no answer, just sipped her whiskey and watched him work, and tried not to think about the fact that she'd gone from fighting to keep her father's 40 acres to fighting to defend an empire she still barely understood. But somewhere in the past months, this place had become hers. These people had become hers. And Rhett, complicated, damaged, infuriating Rhett, had become something she wasn't ready to name but couldn't deny. She was in this now. Not for 6 months, not for money, but because walking away would feel like abandoning something worth fighting for. The question was whether they'd survive long enough for that fight to matter. Morgan's mistake came 3 weeks later, and it was spectacular. He got greedy. Harrison sent word on a cold November morning that Morgan had been caught bribing a territorial land surveyor to falsify boundary reports, trying to claim an additional 200 acres that legally belonged to a widow named Mrs. Chen, who'd been too scared to fight him. The surveyor, facing prison time, had confessed everything in exchange for leniency, and the documentation was irrefutable. Rhett read Harrison's letter twice, then handed it to Eliza without a word. "This is it," she said, scanning the details. "This is what you needed. It's what we all needed." Rhett was already moving toward the door. "Jack, get the men ready. We're riding to the marshal's office." Within an hour, they had a group assembled. Rhett, Jack, Patrick, with his arm still in a sling, and 6 other men who'd been with the ranch long enough to be trusted completely. Eliza watched them prepare to leave, checking weapons and supplies, and made a decision. "I'm coming with you," she said. Rhett turned to her, his expression immediately resistant. "Eliza, don't. I've earned the right to see this through." She met his eyes steadily. "And you said it yourself. We're partners. That means I don't sit home while you finish the fight." He looked like he wanted to argue, but Patrick spoke up first. "She's right, boss. And honestly, having her there makes a statement. Shows Morgan he didn't just fail, he failed in front of the woman he threatened. Rhett's jaw worked, but he nodded. Fine, but you stay close to me. No exceptions. The ride to the territorial marshal's office took most of the day. The office was located in a town called Ridgeway, bigger than Cedar Bluff, but still rough around the edges. The kind of place where justice was negotiable depending on who had more money or influence. The marshal himself was a heavy-set man named Burton, who looked perpetually tired, like enforcing law in this territory was slowly grinding him down. Mercer, he said when they walked in, I wondered when you'd show up. Harrison already sent me the surveyor's confession. And? Rhett's voice was controlled, but Eliza could hear the tension underneath. And it's damning. Morgan's looking at fraud charges, possibly more depending on what else we find once we start digging. Burton leaned back in his chair. Problem is, arresting a man like Morgan isn't simple. He's got friends, resources, lawyers. This is going to be a fight. Then we fight. Rhett set Harrison's letter on the desk. But we do it now, before he has time to cover his tracks or intimidate more witnesses. Burton studied the letter, then looked at the group of armed men standing in his office. You planning on starting a range war if I say no? I'm planning on getting justice for a dead man and everyone else Morgan's hurt. Rhett's voice was hard. You can either help with that, or you can explain to the territorial governor why you let a criminal operate freely because it was too much trouble to arrest him. You threatening me, Mercer? I'm giving you an opportunity to do your job. What you do with it is up to you. Burton was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. All right, I'll issue a warrant, but I'm going to need you and your men to back me up when I serve it. Morgan won't come quietly. We'll be there. They rode to Morgan's ranch at sunset, a group of 15 men including the marshal and 2 deputies. Eliza's heart was hammering the entire way, the pistol in her pocket feeling both too heavy and not heavy enough. This could go wrong in a dozen different ways, and all of them ended in blood. Morgan's men saw them coming and formed a defensive line in front of the main house. Morgan himself emerged onto the porch, and even from a distance, Eliza could see the calculation in his eyes. Marshal, he called, what brings you to my property with such an impressive escort? You know why I'm here, Morgan. Burton held up the warrant. You're under arrest for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. You can come peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. That's quite an accusation. Based on what evidence? Based on a signed confession from the surveyor you bribed. Based on falsified documents with your handwriting on them. Based on testimony from Mrs. Chen and 3 other landowners you tried to cheat. Burton's voice was steady. You're done, Morgan. The only question is whether anyone else gets hurt when we take you in. Morgan's hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, and Eliza saw every man on both sides tense. This was the moment, the point where pride and desperation could turn this into a massacre. You touch that gun, Rhett said quietly, and my men will cut you down before it clears the holster. Is your pride worth dying for? For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Morgan looked past Burton, past the deputies, and his eyes found Eliza. Something ugly twisted in his expression. You think you've won, he said. You think marrying some desperate girl and playing house makes you legitimate. But everyone knows the truth, Mercer. You're just as much a fraud as you claim I am. Maybe, Rhett said, but I'm a fraud with a legal wife, a working ranch, and enough friends to see justice done. What do you have? Morgan's face went purple with rage. His hand actually started to move toward his gun, and Eliza's fingers found the pistol in her pocket, her body acting on instinct and training. But before anyone could draw, one of Morgan's own men stepped forward. Boss, the man said quietly, it's over. Let it go. The betrayal on Morgan's face was almost painful to watch. He looked at his man, then at the warrant in Burton's hand, then at the overwhelming force arrayed against him. Slowly, his hand moved away from his gun. This isn't finished, he said. Yeah, Rhett replied. It is. Burton and his deputies moved forward to take Morgan into custody. His men stood down, some looking relieved, others angry, but unwilling to die for a boss who'd just been proven a criminal. As they led Morgan away in chains, he looked back at Rhett one last time. Everything you built is on sand, Mercer. Someday it'll all come down. Maybe, but not today. They watched Burton's group ride away with their prisoner, and Eliza felt something unknot in her chest that she hadn't realized was there. It wasn't over. There would be trials, legal battles, probably more trouble down the road, but Morgan was contained. The immediate threat was neutralized. "We should go," Jack said quietly, before his men changed their minds about letting us leave peacefully. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out. Men who'd been wound tight with tension for weeks were finally allowing themselves to relax, talking in low voices about what would happen next, how long Morgan would be in jail, whether his operation would collapse without him. Eliza rode beside Rhett in silence, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains and turn the sky into layers of purple and gold. She thought about the woman who'd arrived here months ago, desperate and angry and completely unprepared for what this life would demand. That woman felt like a stranger now. "You're quiet," Rhett said. "Just thinking." About how different everything is from what I expected." She glanced at him. "When you showed up at my door with that offer, I thought I was trading one kind of survival for another. I didn't expect to actually care what happened here. And now? Now I'm realizing that caring might have been the point all along." She said it lightly, but the truth underneath wasn't light at all. "You chose me because you thought I could survive this place. But I think maybe you also chose me because you needed someone who would choose to stay. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to." Rhett was quiet for a long time. Then, "The 6 months are almost up. Another 2 weeks and you can leave if you want. Take the money I promised and start over somewhere else." "I know." "Are you going to?" Eliza looked at the valley opening up below them as they crested the final ridge before home. The ranch spread out in the fading light, smoke rising from chimneys, lights beginning to appear in windows. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, like Rhett himself. "No," she said, "I'm not going anywhere." She heard him exhale, a sound that might have been relief. "Why not?" "Because somewhere between the fire and the ambush and Morgan's arrest, this stopped being your fight and started being ours." She met his eyes. "And because I've spent my whole life on the edge of losing everything. At least here, when I fight to keep it, I'm fighting for something worth having. It won't get easier. There will always be another Morgan, another threat, another crisis." "I know, but there will also be this." She gestured at the valley. "People who depend on us, work that matters, a chance to build something that lasts longer than we do." "That's not what you signed up for." "No, but it's what I'm choosing now." She smiled slightly. "Besides, someone needs to keep you from getting killed by your own stubbornness. Might as well be me." He laughed, a real laugh, rare and genuine. "I'm not sure whether to be insulted or grateful. Be both. I usually am when it comes to you." They rode the rest of the way home in companionable silence, and when they reached the barn, Danny was waiting to take their horses with a grin that said news of Morgan's arrest had already spread through the ranch. "Is it true?" he asked. "They really arrested him?" "They really did," Rhett confirmed. "That's the best thing I've heard in months." Danny's grin widened. "Rosa's making a celebration dinner. She said to tell you both to clean up before you come down because you look like you've been rolling in dirt." Inside the house, the mood was lighter than Eliza had seen it in weeks. Men were actually smiling, talking without constantly watching the windows, letting their guard down for the first time since the mill burned. Rosa had indeed made a feast: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar, even a pie made with the last of the preserved apples. They ate together, all of them, crowding into the dining room and spilling over into the hallway because there wasn't enough space at the table for everyone. Patrick told the story of Morgan's arrest with embellishments that made it sound more dramatic than it had been, and everyone listened like it was the best entertainment they'd had in years. Eliza sat beside Rhett and watched the people around her, these rough, tough men who'd worked themselves half to death to keep this ranch running, who'd risked their lives fighting Morgan's sabotage, who treated her with respect she'd never quite felt she'd earned. And she realized this was what Rhett had been protecting all along. Not just land or money or water rights, but this: community, family, home. Later, after the celebration had wound down and most of the men had gone to their bunks, Eliza found herself on the porch with Rhett, both of them too wired from the day's events to sleep. "I got another letter from Mrs. Patterson yesterday," she said. "My father's doing better. Well enough that the doctor thinks he might actually recover. Not completely, but enough to have years instead of months." "That's good news." "It is." She paused. "He asked when I was coming home. What did you tell him?" "That I'm home." The words felt right in a way she hadn't expected. "Cedar Bluff was where I grew up, But this is where I chose to be. Rhett turned to look at her, his expression serious. I need to tell you something. What? When I married you, I told myself it was purely practical, that I just needed the legitimacy of a wife, nothing more. That after 6 months, if you wanted to leave, I'd let you go without a second thought. He leaned against the porch railing. But that was a lie. Not to you, to myself. Eliza's heart started beating faster. Rhett, let me finish. He ran a hand through his hair. Somewhere in the past few months, this stopped being a business arrangement for me. Watching you learn to ride, learn to shoot, stand up to Morgan at Harrison's gathering, refuse to back down when things got dangerous. He stopped, seeming to search for words. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Eliza. And I don't want you to stay just because you feel obligated or because you think this place needs you. I want you to stay because you want to be here, with me. She stepped closer to him, her hand finding his. I do want to be here, but I need to know something first. What? When you look at me, do you see Catherine? Some echo of the woman who betrayed you? Because I can't build a life with someone who's always waiting for me to prove I'm trustworthy. No? His grip on her hand tightened. I see someone who had every reason to hate me for deceiving her, but chose to stand beside me anyway. I see someone who could have walked away a dozen times, but stayed because it mattered. I see the woman I should have been honest with from the beginning, and I'm asking if there's any chance you can forgive me for not being that smart. Eliza looked at this complicated man who'd offered her survival when she had nothing and somehow given her a life worth fighting for. He wasn't perfect. Neither was she. But maybe that was the point, that they'd both been broken by circumstance and betrayal and loss, and they'd found a way to be broken together in a way that felt almost whole. I forgive you, she said, on one condition. Name it. No more secrets, no more hiding. If we're doing this, really doing this, then we do it honestly, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, he agreed. He pulled her closer, and she let him, her body fitting against his in a way that felt natural despite months of careful distance. When he kissed her, it wasn't the desperate passion of romance novels or the cold transaction of their wedding day. It was something quieter, more real, a promise that they were choosing this, choosing each other with eyes wide open to all the complications that choice entailed. So, he said when they finally pulled apart, does this mean you're staying? It means I'm staying, she confirmed. But I have conditions. Of course you do. I want to be involved in the ranch decisions. Really involved, not just consulted when you feel like it. Done. And I want to bring my father here when he's well enough to travel. He can't work the farm anymore, but he shouldn't have to die alone either. The house has plenty of room. He's welcome. And I want to start a school for the workers' children and any other families in the area who need it. Rosa's been teaching Maria to read, but she needs help, and there are at least 6 other children on this ranch who deserve an education. Rhett smiled. Anything else? I want a real wedding, not a courthouse transaction with a bored clerk. Something that means we're choosing this, not just completing a contract. I can arrange that. He kissed her forehead. Though I should warn you, I'm not very good at romance. I don't need romance. I need partnership. Everything else we can figure out as we go. Deal. They stood on the porch together, watching the stars come out over the valley, and Eliza felt something settle in her chest that she eventually recognized as peace, not the absence of struggle. There would always be struggles out here, always be challenges and threats and things that needed fighting for. But the certainty that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, on a clear December day when the mountains were white with fresh snow and the valley was quiet under winter's grip. Not a courthouse affair this time, but a real ceremony in the ranch's main hall with everyone who worked there in attendance, plus Harrison and his wife, Mrs. Chen and her family, and even Burton the marshal, who'd apparently developed a grudging respect for Rhett after Morgan's arrest. Eliza's father made the journey from Cedar Bluff, thin and still weak, but alive in a way the doctors had said was impossible. He walked her down the makeshift aisle, his hand trembling on her arm, and when he handed her to Rhett, there were tears in his eyes that had nothing to do with sorrow. You take care of my girl, he told Rhett. I will. And she'll take care of me right back. Thomas laughed. Yeah, I figured that part out already. The ceremony itself was simple. No flowery speeches or grand declarations, Just honest promises made in front of people who mattered. Rosa cried. Maria played a fiddle that was only slightly out of tune. Patrick gave a toast that was equal parts heartfelt and inappropriate, making everyone laugh. And when Rhett kissed his bride for the second time, the first time really, as a real husband and not just a legal one, Eliza felt the last piece of her old life fall away. She wasn't the desperate girl from Cedar Bluff anymore. She was Eliza Mercer, partner in an empire built on stubbornness and survival, wife to a man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen her anyway. The celebration lasted well into the night, but eventually the guests dispersed and the ranch settled into quiet. Eliza and Rhett stood in what was now truly their bedroom, the awkwardness of their first months replaced by an understanding that had been built through fire and crisis, and the slow, painful work of learning to trust. No regrets? Rhett asked. None. You? Just that I didn't tell you the truth from the beginning. Could have saved us both a lot of anger. Maybe. But maybe we needed the anger to get here. She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley. Everything worth having requires some kind of fight. This was ours. He came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Thank you. For what? For seeing what this place could be. For fighting for it when you had no reason to. For choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. He paused. For being exactly as strong as I hoped you'd be, and nothing like what I expected. I could say the same about you. They stood together in comfortable silence, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought her here. From her father's failing farm to this empire in the mountains, from desperation to choice, from survival to something that felt startlingly like happiness. It hadn't been smooth or easy or anything close to perfect, but it had been real, and that mattered more than perfection ever could. Over the following months, the ranch continued to evolve. The new mill was completed in March, bigger and more efficient than the one Morgan had burned. The school opened in April with 6 students and Eliza as the primary teacher, though she recruited Thomas to help with mathematics and Rosa to teach sewing and practical skills. Morgan was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, his ranch sold to cover his debts. Several of his workers came to Rhett looking for employment, and he hired the ones who seemed honest. Harrison's railroad contracts continued to grow, and Rhett's timber operation with them. The ranch prospered in a way that felt almost unreal after so much struggle, but Eliza had learned by now that prosperity was just as much work as survival. It just came with different problems. Thomas Rowan moved to the ranch permanently in late spring, taking over a small cabin on the eastern edge of the property where he could watch the sunrise and tend a garden that gave him purpose without demanding more strength than he had. He walked with a cane now, and his cough never fully went away. But he was alive and relatively content, surrounded by people who treated him with respect instead of pity. You did well for yourself, girl, he told Eliza one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sunset. We both did, Papa. You taught me how to fight for what matters. I just applied those lessons to a bigger battlefield. Your mother would be proud. I know I am. By summer, the ranch had expanded again, not through conquest or acquisition, but through careful partnerships with smaller operations that needed support and were willing to collaborate rather than compete. Eliza found she had a gift for negotiation, for finding solutions that benefited everyone involved instead of just demanding surrender. You're better at this than I am, Rhett admitted one night after she'd successfully brokered a deal that had been stalled for weeks. I'm better at talking to people. You're better at intimidating them into compliance. She grinned. Between the two of us, we're almost competent. Almost. Let's not get cocky. The following spring brought news that changed everything again, though this time in a way that felt like possibility rather than threat. Eliza was pregnant. She told Rhett on a morning when the valley was green with new growth and the air smelled like rain and pine. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally settling on something that looked like wonder. You're sure? He asked. The doctor's sure. I'm sure. Rosa's sure, and she's been sure for 3 weeks before I was willing to believe it. We're having a baby. We're having a baby, she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms, and she felt him shaking slightly. I have no idea how to be a father. Good thing you've got 9 months to figure it out, and I have no idea how to be a mother, so we'll be incompetent together. Our specialty. The baby came in December. a daughter with Rhett's dark hair and Eliza's stubborn chin, born during a snowstorm that isolated the ranch for 3 days. Rosa and the doctor delivered her while Rhett paced holes in the floor downstairs, and when Eliza finally held her daughter for the first time, she understood in a way she never had before what it meant to build something that would outlast her. They named her Catherine Rose. Rose for Rosa, who'd helped bring her into the world, and Catherine because Rhett insisted on reclaiming that name from his past and giving it new meaning. Eliza agreed because she understood that sometimes you had to take the things that hurt you and transform them into something worth keeping. The ranch continued to grow. The daughter grew with it, learning to walk in the shadow of mountains, learning to ride before she could write her name, learning from both parents that strength came in many forms, and survival was a skill worth mastering. And through it all, Eliza and Rhett built something that neither of them could have built alone. Not an empire exactly, though it looked like one from the outside. What they built was smaller and more precious than that. They built a home, a family, a life that had started in desperation and evolved into choice, that had been forged in conflict and tempered by compromise, that was messy and complicated and real in all the ways that mattered. Years later, when their daughter asked how they'd met, Eliza told her the truth, that it had started as a transaction between two desperate people, that her father had lied and her mother had been angry, that they'd fought more than they'd agreed in those early months. But she also told her daughter that the best things in life were rarely simple or easy, that sometimes survival and love looked exactly the same, and that choosing to stay was often braver than choosing to run. The world will try to make you choose between strength and kindness, Eliza told her, between protecting yourself and trusting others, between survival and happiness. But those aren't real choices. You can be all of those things at once. You just have to be willing to fight for it. Like you and Papa did? Exactly like that. And standing on the porch of the house they'd defended and expanded and filled with life, watching her daughter chase chickens across the yard while Rhett argued with Jack about timber contracts and Thomas dozed in the sun, Eliza realized that the desperate girl who'd married a stranger to save her father's farm had gotten exactly what she'd asked for, even if it looked nothing like what she'd expected. She'd asked for survival. What she'd received was a life worth living, built not on certainty or comfort, but on the stubborn refusal to give up when things got hard, on the willingness to trust even after betrayal, on the understanding that the strongest foundations were the ones built through struggle. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real.
That's correct. You are not wrong there. We were talking about the booty earlier tonight, and we were talking about side quests. I'm going to be starting some side quests as well. So one thing I'm going to be doing because I'm a ceramicist. I like to make pottery, but I'm very much in my early stages, right? I'm essentially a Jill of all trades, right? And my ADHD knows no bounds. So if it's a makers and crafting space, I will probably say yes to it and try it at least once. For example, this is the first piece of pottery made in the home studio. I have not made a piece since because bodies be weird. My spoons are not aplenty. And yeah, then that's okay. So we mostly do fiber arts here. I learned how to knit several, I'd say like 4 or 5-ish months ago. And in honor of my great grandmother who knitted me a top similar to this color, and it was a sleeveless top when I was 18. I am, in her honor, in her memory, I'm making a replica of that same top because I adored that top so much, and it made such an impression on me as far as the craftsmanship of knitting and how that it's such a time consuming and it's such a love. It's such a love. Words the words are hard, but you get what I'm saying. It's a you put your heart into something, and it's just such a way to show someone how much you care and how much you love them, And unfortunately, she passed away at the end of October last year, and that's when I decided to pick up knitting in her memory. So yeah, so I'm making this top passion project. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We could call it that. That's a great way to put it. Labor of love. Yes, exactly. That's I think the word or the phrase labor of love. Yeah. Kamaya said, oh, and by the way, to your point, is it Jolly? I don't know how to say your name, or just let me know how to say your name. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, or Dawn or Fox, however you'd like to be, you'd like me to call you. Um, we were talking about making butts, putting booty on different crafted pieces where you normally wouldn't have a butt. And we were thinking about booty mugs. So getting a butt on the booty, or getting a butt on the booty, putting a booty on a mug. You're getting what I'm saying? A tush mug. We'll call it a tushy mug. I don't know, but we we have a fun creative process. Butts on butts on butts. Exactly. Um, it's going to be a butting butts, like shipping ships at some point. Um, yeah, we do a little bit of everything here, and side quests are such a fun thing. So, one of my side quests is going to be starting a